Hello, everyone. I was going to say good afternoon, but good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our, for us, lunchtime program. I'm Erin Bartram. I'm the school programs coordinator here at the Mark Twain House. We're real happy to have you here. If you need live captioning for this, you can hit live transcript at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to have that as we go along. So we're welcoming today two wonderful people, Kate Lister and Melinda Chateauvert, for a discussion of Kate's new book, Harlots, Whores, and Hackabouts, History of Sex for Sale. If the title alone doesn't hook you, I don't really know what we can do. I'm going to introduce both of them a little more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House Museum's virtual author programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We're happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and CT Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of this being virtual, in addition to the fact that we are in 3 time zones, is that you as the audience can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guests' discussion. And we do encourage you to do so. We'll also be posting the link to purchase a copy of Kate's book from the Mark Twain store. You have many purchasing options, but getting your copy through our store not only supports programs like this, but supports the museum in general. If you have a specific question for either of our guests, you can go ahead and put that directly in the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom window. I'll come back after they've finished chatting for a while, and I'll draw from what's in that Q&A section to ask them some questions. The temptation often is to drop your questions in the chat. The chat goes by real fast, and it's hard for me necessarily to write them all down as you ask. So if you really have a question you want addressed, I would put it in the Q&A. Now that I've said all of that, let's meet our guests. So Dr. Kate Lister is a lecturer for the School of Arts and Communications at Leeds Trinity University. Kate primarily researches the literary history of sex work and curates the online research project Whores of Yore, an interdisciplinary digital archive for the study of historical sexuality. Kate has also published in the medical humanities, material culture, Victorian studies, and neo-medievalism. She regularly writes about the history of sexuality for News, Vice, and the Wellcome Trust. Kate won the Sexual Freedom Publicist of the Year Award in 2017. And she'll be in conversation with Melinda Chateauvert, PhD, who is a writer, a historian, and activist with 3 decades of experience in movements for gender equality, sexual freedom, and civil rights advocacy. Working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Dr. Chateauvert has served as an expert witness in class action litigation, challenging race discrimination in higher education and public contracting, as well as documenting racial bias in death penalty cases. Her book, Marching Together, Women of the Brotherhood, documents the work of African-American women in organizing the AFL-CIO. I skipped a line, and I bet she realized it. In organizing the Brotherhood of Sleep, because I was like, I know this book. In organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first international Black trade union in the AFL-CIO. It remains the standard for labor historians, can confirm. Her recent book, Sex Workers Unite, A History of the Movement from Stonewall to Slutwalk, traces the vital activism of sex workers at the fringes of gay liberation, AIDS activism, labor organizing, and the long struggle against police violence and criminalization. So please sit back and enjoy. Don't forget there'll be Q&A at the end, so drop your questions in the Q&A as we go. And I'd like to mention, welcome both of our guests to the quote unquote stage. And when you guys reach a natural endpoint, just let me know and I'll pop back on.
Thank you. Thank you, Darren. I don't see you. Okay, making sure we got everybody here. Hi, how are you? Kate, we talked a little bit yesterday, but I suppose the best way to start this is tell us about your book for everybody who has heard the title and wants to know more.
I'm always happy to talk about my book, but when I'm talking to you about my book, it does feel a little bit like, yeah, but you wrote the book. So the book it was always going to be really difficult, but it was about the history of sex work. But then that's such a huge, vast expand. Where'd you start? Where'd you go? Who do you want to write about? Who are you going to leave out? So it started off as this kind of like, well, I want to write about it, but how on earth do you do that? So it's very much like a potted history. I think that you could have encyclopedias of this, but I wanted to try and give a sense of how sex for sale has been treated differently around the world and in different time periods. But I think what was really important to me, and you probably know this as a historian of sex work as well, is how similar the debates still are. They're like, you know, that we can look at ancient Mesopotamia and we can say, God, it's so different. It's so different. It's you know, it might have been in the temples and it, you know, it was associated with goddesses. But then also you look at the evidence for the legalization and you can see that they were still having the same debates and arguments that we are today about should it be legal, where should it be, who's allowed to do it, who's not allowed to do it. And I saw this cyclical approach that was still doing the same thing when it comes to people that sell sex. So that was really important to me, to give a kind of a sense of how different it's been, but also how similar it's been.
I think one of the things, though, that's so nice about your book is that you also, however, bring a lot of personalities directly to the reader, both through your text and through your the illustrations and photographs that you have. And that's something that's really, you know, better than just, I mean, it gives a sense of, yes, these are human beings. These are women and men and transgender people who have been doing this all these years, all these decades, all these millennia. Was that can you talk about some of the people that you particularly you found particularly interesting that you have in this book?
Oh God, I mean, that is one of the most frustrating things about not just studying the history of sex work, but this history of sex is that you kind of get, you know, without making it sound too weird, you get quite close to it, but you can never quite like get hold of it because sex workers have been so marginalized and stigmatized throughout history. Their voices are lost to us so often. What you tend to have left is legal records or medical records or what the church fathers had to say about it, or this. What you don't have is an "Are you there, God, it's me, Margaret" equivalent of just what like sex work was like in medieval Britain. So finding voices is really hard, and what you tend to find is somebody has to have done something pretty substantial to have sort of left a record. The ones that I really love looking at are the photographs from the 19th century, and I love the ones of Storyville in New Orleans, which was the designated, I suppose you call it red light area, that was set up in the city. And there was a photographer, E.J. Belloc, and he photographed the women in the brothels, but he didn't do it really salaciously. It would have been too easy to have gone and sort of created soft porn, but he doesn't. What he does is you get this image of almost like the backstage of these women. They're just kind of sat around smoking cigarettes and drinking some wine, and there's one of them talking to like playing with a cat, and it's just, but you don't know what their names are or who they are, and that for me is like, that's almost like the entire history of sex work. Is you get close to it, but I don't know. I want to know, like, what was her name? What was she having a good day? Was she having a bad day? Is like, was that her cat? Was that someone else's cat? What was, you know, like, what was her story? And you just kind of left. So I love looking at those because they're very beautiful and very humanizing and also mysterious. But I think my favorite sex worker from out history, I think it's probably got to be Nell Gwynn, because her hustle was just legendary. So for people that don't know, Nell Gwynn was born into abject poverty in London in the early 17th century, and she managed to get on the stage, became a good actress, had a cracking pair of legs apparently, and she became the mistress of the king. So well done, Nell. That was quite literally shagging your way to the top, wasn't it? And she was really popular with the people because she was kind of cheeky and naughty, and there's like lots of stories about her. Like she was being carried in a sedan chair through the city, and the carriage stopped because her the guy carrying it got into a fight with another guy on the street, and so she got out and she was like, what are you doing? And the guy explained, he called you a whore, so I stopped to have a fight with him. And Nell said, well, I am a whore, so let's carry on. So I think, yeah, she's probably my favorite. Her hustle's legendary.
And yet she wasn't unique. I mean, in that time, there were other women who certainly made it, if not perhaps becoming the mistress to the queen, definitely had quite, I don't want to just even say the hustle, but they had a business, they were successful, they managed to finance other people, other women, and other brothels, and even other projects. I mean, I think you have also a couple of examples there of the kinds of, I'll use the word charity, but charitable work that madams and sex workers and others have actually done to, better the world rather than just themselves.
Yeah, that's I think that one of the things that often gets overlooked with the history of sex work is, well, first, of course men were selling sex, of course, and they still are, and they always have been, and of course women buy sex, but by and large it's been women selling and men buying, or at least that's the most socially accepted model that we have. And I think something that we often forget, that gets lost in all the moralizing and the kind of the panic around it, is that throughout history this has been one of the very few ways that women could make money and have agency for themselves in a deeply patriarchal world where choices are incredibly limited. Like if you're a woman in the 17th century, how are you going to make your money? What are you going to do for your money? There's no careers that you can go and have. Or you could join a nunnery. You could marry it, was the hope, I suppose, which is effectively sex work, just one man at a time, isn't it? Really, that's what that is.
That's what Emma Goldman said. So yes,
exactly, right. And I think that it would be women that ran the brothels. That's almost always what seemed to happen, and it allowed women to make a lot of money in a very short space of time. And it was a career
and
that
to
was
use that money for social good too. I think that was the other part I was really trying to think about, is the schools that were funded. There was one, I think you mentioned, of a woman who said she would rebuild the walls of a city.
Yeah.
It's a great and but she said if she would do it, and this is in the before Christ. I mean, this is like before the Christian era. And she said, but you have to mark that I was the one who paid for it. And the city fathers said, no, we can't have that on there. Right.
Yeah.
So
that was Phryne, and she was a courtesan of ancient Greece, legendary, and she was actually probably the model for one of the first statues of the female form in ancient Greece, the Aphrodite of Knossos or Knidos, and it caused an absolute scandal and sensation in ways like you can't even. It's just like a statue of a nude woman doing like proper, Aphrodite stuff. So she's kind of got like the pose and like the hair, but like people freaked out when this was first unveiled. Like men were masturbating around it. Like people got caught trying to have sex with it in the middle of the night. That's how it was. And apparently Phryne was the model for Aphrodite. And she had earned so much money that she offered to rebuild the wall of Thebes after it was destroyed by Alexander the Great, but only, as you said, on the condition that they said destroyed by Alexander, rebuilt by Phryne the whore. Then they said no.
But yeah, so this is the kind of thing. Now, I know that you did a lot of research, I mean, historical research back into a lot of areas. This must have taken you. I know that with your website, which I've of course followed, and your Instagram account with the Whores of Yore, you get tidbits of a lot of that. But this book is wonderful because you have much more depth to a lot of those stories. And it's also more contextual than obviously you can do in social media. So tell me a little bit about how you approach the research.
Oh,
we're both historians. Let's talk a little geek shop, okay?
It was so difficult because I just started researching it and the pandemic hit, and then so because I really wanted to do a chapter on Mesopotamia. I wanted to do Italy. I wanted to do Japan and China, but I don't speak those languages. I'm just an ignorant Western person. So normally what I'd do is I would make contact with fellow academics and kind of ask for help, or I'd go to the archives and try and get, like do research there. But suddenly everything was closed. like everything. And people, like it's in the middle of a pandemic, who's going to respond to an email from a random crazy woman going, hello, what's the Mesopotamian word for blowjob? And it's just like, nobody's going to do that. So it was really, really difficult. It took, like, everything was so much harder to research because all I had was online archives for a lot of it. Luckily there were some chapters where I'm kind of like, that's my wheelhouse, I know where I am with that, that's okay. The ones on the 19th century Britain, for example, medieval, that was fine. I've been in the archives already, but a lot of it was trying to find people who could help me with the translations. There was a really, really nice professor who helped me translate some of the Mesopotamia stuff. So yes, a lot of it was asking for help, which I think is something that the academics do a lot, and we should say that we do that. But yeah, so it was relying on the work that other people have already done, and also that the ones that I could get into the archives of the British Museum and the National Archives. That was where I went for that one, but obviously some of it was limited because no one was going to fund me to go to Japan in the middle of a pandemic.
And maybe even not after a pandemic or before.
No.
That's the problem, right?
No.
Exactly. So there's always things that are left out.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you had to leave out, even though you had the material, but in making those kind of editorial decisions? And if you could, if it could have been the encyclopedia, what were, like, give me one or two of the things that you really would have liked to have seen in the book that just had to be chosen?
There was ones that it was like, I just don't have the time and the resources to research this properly, because it was taking, I was trying to like learn Japanese and Chinese to get the chapter done, and that was taking forever. But I discovered that there was a tradition of courtesans in India who had resisted the oppression of the British Raj, that they were actually like rebels and activists for Indian authority and independence, and they such powerful women, and I really, really wanted to write about them, but I just didn't. I'd missed the deadline by quite a lot, but I've sort of mentally stored them away to just be like, I'm going to come back to them at some point. So I would love to write.
Yeah, you said love to write. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I'd love to write more about them. Absolutely. That if there's a next book, they will definitely be in there.
Well, and because the movement there is so strong.
Yeah.
And recently the Supreme Court of India ruled that sex work is labor and should have job protections and should be recognized as such. So there's a lot of changes that are going on, and so much of that, I mean, some of the organizations there have thousands of members and are doing incredible work. So that's, definitely, maybe that's worth just doing your whole piece on alone.
I think that you could do it. I mean, the sort of the history in India is, again, it could be filed under white people fucked it up again. Sorry. But so
I'm sitting in America, so it's not like I can't say the same thing. Right?
But the sort of the practice of selling sex, and it's very difficult because we look at it with our modern view and our modern words, which bring with them layers of shame and layers of judgments. If you try and say prostitution, it carries with it cultural weight and baggage that we've got to try and unpack ourselves. But if you're trying to find prostitution in India before the British Raj, you're already set off to try and find something that perhaps, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's just what they saw looks very, very different from what Western eyes saw. So the practice of the Devdasi, for example, who were temple, and still are, temple girls dedicated to the goddess Yelama, who would have sex and then raise money for patrons. In their heyday, these were enormously powerful women. Enormously powerful. They would have patrons, they would be protected, and you must make the mistake of thinking that it was like that for everybody. That wouldn't be true either. You've got to bring in everything. But it was the British colonial rule who came over and saw that and said, well, this is disgraceful and awful and terrible, and made it illegal and set about abolishing it, which then meant that the Devdasi didn't have any protection, they didn't have any standing, and they're still outcast to this day. So that's it's a sad history.
You touched on this, and I think it's worth talking about, not just for the reasons of the book, but also for the audience, we have lots of words for sex work. And even the term itself, which is of such a rich, such new origin, given the, millennial, which people have engaged in commercial sex or exchange for money or whatever, or other considerations, as the law says in California. Let's talk a little bit about some of these terms, because I think for some of us in the United States, hackabout, you've got this sex word, whores, harlots, and hackabouts, but it's a lovely alliteration. But hackabout is not necessarily a word that I think Americans are familiar with. So do you want to do some translation to talk about some of these terms?
Well, I'll tell you about the title. There's a story with the title, but a hackabout was an 18th century term for a woman that sold sex, and it's sort of like in sort of like the category of like harlot. It had a sort of a jokey sort of knockabout feel. It was more slang than proper terminology. And William Hogarth, who was an artist in the 18th century, he did a series called The Harlot's Progress, which sort of depicted the rise and fall of this particular harlot, and he called her Moll Hackabout. So it was this kind of sort of like jokey expression for a sex worker, and the alliteration, it worked quite nicely. But that wasn't what the title was supposed to be. The title was supposed to be Tales from Grope Cunt Lane, but I wasn't allowed to have it.
Well, I had to fight over my title too, so I understand.
Did you? It's like the publishers wanted to have this like really sexy and title that was like, it's like really jazzy. I think at one point they wanted to call it Sisters of the Night. It's like, well, they're not vampires. What on earth? What are you doing? But that was like what they wanted. But then I was so desperate not to stigmatize people selling sex. The stuff I was coming up with was ridiculously boring. It was like, a select history of some people who elected to possibly sell sex in exchange for good. And then so that we finally came up with this, because Grope Cunt Lane was the name of the street in medieval London, all one word, that people would sell sex on. It was a lane for doing exactly the thing that it says that it was for. But I thought that was brilliant, because tales is also slang for a sex worker. So you had tales from, and then an actual historical place name. And the British publishers went, yeah, brilliant, we loved it. And then they kicked it up to the American publishers, and they just went, no. So yeah, so I was allowed to call it that.
But also, this gives it sort of a chance to actually be more global too.
This is true. That's exactly what they said. That is exactly what I said when I was having my little strop of just like.
And of course, you have some of these beautiful photographs. You have so many wonderful illustrations here. Are these have you collected these? Are these from the Welcome Center? I mean, how did you go about? There was a comment that I read, and just to make this a little quicker, but to give a context to that, one review, and I know I hate reading reviews of my own stuff, but this said, well, it's just a lot of pictures, and it's only pictures from the. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, I've had that. I've heard that before in like some quite big publications. There's one in the Guardian as well, and they weren't happy because they felt that the pictures in it weren't miserable enough. That was like sort of the big feedback. It's like, that's such a weird thing. And there are a lot of pictures in it. But I wanted it to be really beautiful. I wanted it. And the thing is like the words are really important, and I can talk to you about this, that, and the other, and I can tell you what happened, but an image is 1,000 words. And I think that an image gets you closer to who these people were and what was happening than I can describe. I think that a picture of a woman in a brothel in 19th century Paris is so powerful, and it's so important, because it's just that window that I was like, I want to have the images, because I want as many faces as I can and as many names as I can, and even if I don't know anything about them, that's what's really important. So it does have a lot of pictures in, and there are a number of people, it's just loads of pictures. Like, yeah, I know, but it's not like it's a colouring book or anything. And I wanted to, but a lot of them were from the Wellcome Trust. A lot of them, they let me run loose in their archives for a good long while, pulling lots of stuff out. Some of them we had to get down on bended knee and beg for permission to use them. The ones from Belloc and Storyville had to write a proper groveling, please, 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 can we use them?
Right.
One like that. And some of them are from the British Museum. So they're from all over. And so we curated them together, and it was sort of a case of like trying to find the right images. And then there was some when, like, there was one that the editor had found, they put in, and we spotted it at the last minute, but it was actually a Greek vase that depicted, it was a picture of paedophilia, but we hadn't clocked it. I was like, shit, because that was woo. Yeah, so there's a lot of editing and curating the pictures very, very carefully, because people do things very differently in the past.
Yeah. And our values are different and our words are different, as you said. And, you know, we've gotten to the point where, yeah, sex work, but then there are those activists that I know, at least in the America, and actually elsewhere too, who reject the word sex work and want to embrace the word prostitute and reevaluate. And certainly that's something that has been done in other identity movements, if you will. So there is, I think, also an argument for that. So, you know, we're always going to struggle around language. So I also wanted to, so we got the hackabout, we got the horse. What other things in terms of this? You had some particular stories that I liked. I think the other political argument that infuses much of this, or the policy argument, if you will, as opposed to just that props up the cultural work that you've done here, is the argument for decriminalization. And also not just so much for decriminalization, but that the ways that those who engaged in commercialized sex become dehumanized and face all kinds of violence, not just from the state, but from the wanker on the street. Let's just use the language. So let's talk a little bit about, yes, those ideas, those policies keep getting regenerated and regenerated, as we know. How did you deal with that? I mean, what is there a good period that you want to say? Is there good old days for prostitutes, for sex workers?
No. I think that's kind of crap, isn't it? I think that probably, and I say this knowing how bad things are at the moment, but I think that the time that has the most enlightened and forward-thinking approach to sex work is probably our own, which isn't, and it's not universal and it's not everywhere, and that is probably as hopeful as it is like, oh God, really? Because it's still illegal around the world. But we do have countries and places now that have brought in decriminalization. And for anyone who's tuned in who doesn't know the difference, which is fine, lots of people don't, but so legalization is when sex work is legal, but it's monitored by the state. So the state says, well, you can do it, but you can only do it in these conditions, in this place, at this time, be registered, blah, 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 in this zone. Decriminalization is the removal of all laws pertaining to sex work. So it's protected just as under all labor laws, and any kind of sexual offences or anything like that is already protected. And that is the model that has allowed workers to unionize in New South Wales and New Zealand. It allows people to take employers to court. It allows better relationships with the police. It's the model that's supported by Amnesty International and the Lancet and all manner of organizations around the world, because whenever you try and legislate around sex work, and I hope that the history and all the work that's going on around history to recover it can show that, is it doesn't work. If your aim is to abolish people selling sex, which I would also like say you need to stop. Well, why do you need to abolish people selling sex? Like what is happening there? And then there's always argument people are forced into it, and which is true, but that's illegal already. Like it's illegal to force people to have sex. It's rape. It's illegal to coerce people, and none of that would change under decriminalization. But we do have to accept the fact that people want to sell sex and people want to buy sex, and they are deserving of rights. And we have a real state of cognitive dissonance around it. You know, is people will watch porn. They'll watch porn and enjoy porn and think of themselves as having nothing to do with the sex industry at all. As if you've watched porn, even if you didn't pay for it, which makes you doubly naughty, but if you've watched porn, you've used the services of a sex worker. That person was paid money to do that so you could enjoy it. But we don't want to give those people rights. So decriminalization is the best way, and it's not a panacea, it's a start. But when you criminalize it, you add to the stigma. Because you're basically saying this is wrong, this is terrible, and it's the stigma that's really dangerous. Because as you said there, the violence that's enacted against sex workers, why that group, why are they more vulnerable? And it's because of the stigma, because they've already been othered by us as a dominant culture as being less than. And you can see like these little microaggressions all the time. Like if a sex worker is murdered by a client, you can bet your bottom dollar that the newspaper will say prostitute murdered, not her name, not who she was, not prostitute. And it's a real dehumanizing thing. So the stigma is the really big one that we've got to tackle, because it stops people being safe. It stops people accessing services and all manner of things. So that's the one that we need to work on.
And it persists even after people stop engaging in commercial sex. That taint continues to be a mark that is used. There are, the number of women and men that I've heard from who have had to quit high security jobs because they once engaged, they were arrested for, something years ago. Or like in the States, a lot of licensing you cannot get if you have it's only for prostitution if you have those. So those are the kinds of things that we keep going through and everything else. You mentioned just briefly, and I want to kind of push on that a minute, because it is, of course, still the main panic that's happening here and around the world, which is trafficking and the traffic in women. Not that this isn't the first or the second or the fourth panic around sex and sex work, but you see, and I think that, as you said, with Amnesty International and even with the major anti-trafficking groups, the real anti-trafficking groups are saying that prostitution, sex work should be decriminalized. Do you want to talk a little bit about how trafficking is part of this discussion? Because most people, some of the laws say all human trafficking is prostitution. Prostitution is human trafficking.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, really important point, because critics of decriminalization and critics that say that sex work is always rape and it's always exploitative sort of have this idea that those fighting for decriminalization think that selling sex is just absolutely loads of fun. It's a case of jolly hockey sticks. Everyone's having a marvelous time, and it's the happy hooker myth. And that isn't true at all. You can look at something like sex work and look at the dangers and still understand that it being decriminalized helps the people who are in trouble. Because when you've made something illegal, it is much, much harder for anybody to ask for help. It's hard. If it's illegal to sell sex, then how are you going to report to the police that you have been hurt by a client? Because you have to report a crime. And there is something called the Nordic Model, where they suggest that you criminalize the client and not the worker. And that doesn't do much good either, because you've just criminalized how people make their money. So it's not about saying this is an absolutely smashing time and everybody's thoroughly enjoying it. And it's not about denying that people are abused and trafficked into sex work and prostitution, but putting it in the hands of the criminals only does not help those people, and it never has. And the other thing as well is that we've got to try and unpack it a little bit, is that what is it particularly about sex work? Because more people are trafficked into domestic slavery and agricultural slavery and construction than are into sexual slavery. And yet nobody is calling for cleaners to be made illegal, and nobody's calling for construction industry to be absolutely abolished. So the idea is that we empower the people who are in those businesses, and we make it easier to find the people. And if you criminalize it, if you make it illegal, then you've placed it in the hands of the criminals. So it's saying that you fight for decriminalization and you don't think the state should be regulating it is not about saying it's absolutely marvelous, smashing, and nobody gets hurt. It's about acknowledging the dangers, and this is the best way to help people. And that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down here in New Orleans right now, and obviously we have the myth of Storyville, and then we have the reality of what sex work in this city looks like now, and it's so different, and there's so many things going on that you also have to understand all those different layers of ways that people engage in commercialized sex.
Yeah.
There's Bourbon Street, of course, but then there are, these young trans women of color who are hanging out underneath the Claiborne Expressway, at 2 o'clock in the morning or 6 a.m. And there's all these different layers and activities too. And what we've dealt with sometimes is, well, the people on Bourbon Street, they're much more protected, but we're not, but so we're going to leave them alone, but we're going to go after these. And the criminalization in a state that has 500 years of racial oppression also makes for an entirely different situation when you're talking about decrim here, because it is so much a tool used to maintain white supremacy. And I'm going to use those terms because those are actually the way that the New Orleans police actually, engage. And if you look at that pattern. So yeah, I mean, I think the decriminalization is not something, when we talk about it, yes, it's going to help sex workers, but it's also a tool for dismantling white supremacy. It's a tool for dismantling a lot of the overuse of the police that, especially in the United States, we have become so enwrapped in. So put that into.
And it's also, it's very class-based as well. It's like the people that feel the brunt of police crackdown and enforcement will be the poorest, and the most visible, usually the people selling sex on the street. We don't apply those same rules to like OnlyFans or sex phone lines or escorting or sugaring or any of these different words. In fact, if you said to someone doing those things, do you identify as a prostitute, they'd probably say no. So these are the people that sort of make a lot of money, and it's kind of oddly sanitized in our view about it. But the person selling sex on the street corner because they're in abject poverty and they're just trying to get by, they're the ones that will feel the full force of the law. And we have a real state of cognitive dissonance around it, and we always have. And I think that the richer the client, the more money you make, the more socially acceptable it is. Then you're a mistress.
Private. And the more privately,
yes.
It's the private public in some ways too. And I think the final thing, and this may be too much to bite off, but one of the things you were saying at one point, and I kind of didn't want to, this is the part of that dissonance, is I've talked to a lot of young students today, past 10 years or so, and one question that I like asking them is, would you do sex work? And they're like, yeah, I'd do sex. I'd be a dancer. I'd do something like that. A lot of them are like, okay, they have stripper dreams, right? I'll leave it at that. I like to call it the stripper dreams, right? And yet then when I say, and what would you say if your boyfriend or your partner went to a strip club? Would you be upset? And they're like, oh yes, oh my gosh, I don't know if I could handle that. And that's another way that the dissonance, I think, really feeds into so much of our stigmatizing. It's like, well, I might do it, but if my boyfriend went to one of those, I would be upset. And if my boyfriend used money to pay for a sex worker, I'd be upset. So it's kind of this, as I say, this is the dissonance, but I also think it's part of a precarity that women, non-sex working women and even sex working women have in terms of their dependence on, this sort of, I call it a romantic idea of monogamy and marriage. So that's a whole lot of things to unpack, but to me, that's one of the ways that when I'm thinking about stigma and how it operates on the individualized level, we need to think about a little bit more and have more discussions about.
God, that's fascinating. And I think that like you said, that's the fantasy, isn't it? If you've ever been backstage at a strip club or a brothel or wherever it is, you suddenly realize that the fantasy you think it is, it's really, really not. And if you knew what that dancer was thinking when your boyfriend is sat there pissed attempting to stuff dollar bills into a G-string, you probably wouldn't be too jealous. But it's I think that you're right. really good at like boxing it off. And it's because when you think of prostitution, we've all got stereotypes that we think of. We think of the person selling sex on the street, the person who is addicted to drugs or is trafficked, and that person does exist, but that is, and everyone's trying to like distance themselves from it. Even people within sex work will be like, well, I'm not a prostitute, I'm not a street sex worker, I'm not this, I'm not that. And it's kind of like, look guys, we are all in this together, you know, like we've got to start pulling it. Because I was what was called a sugar baby for years when I was finishing my PhD and my postdoc. And even when I started that, if someone had said, you a sex worker, you're a prostitute, I'd have gone, no, yeah, I was. But like, that's how internalized it is. You can be actually doing it yourself and telling yourself, no, I'm not doing that. That's how pervasive it is.
And that's our class and race biases too,
Yes.
popping in there, as well as everything else that lays in there. Well, I think it's almost time to see if there are, I see some questions in the audience. I'm going to let you, did I not ask you something before we get to those questions from the audience? Did I not ask you something that you wanted to say?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I loved your book about the sex worker rights, that the fight for it. What is the earliest record that you found of sex workers coming together to like fight for their rights? Because I was really struggling to find examples of it, like before Stonewall and before how old?
Oh, much earlier. Actually, I'm doing another piece for it's going to be from Cambridge. It's the Encyclopedia of history of sexuality that some friends of mine are editing, and I'm doing the piece on sex worker activism. This is American based, so it's going to say US, but I've been looking even at the women who were transported here in the 17th century, who, as you mentioned in your book, of course, were often women who might have done or did some kind of prostitution, but actually got, you know, transported because theft was the crime. And of course, you know, there are literary examples. Mal Flanders is a literary example, but I'm looking at some of the other ways that women resisted even within that. And I think resistance can be, you know, obviously there's individual, there is collective, there's the sense of, you know, if you take women are running away or women are trying to take care of themselves, I think are forms of resistance when you're talking about a stigmatized kind of personality or person. But if you want to go to collective, I have this great, just one line, and I'm going to just tell you this story. And it's instructive because it also tells us about the way historians have also stigmatized sex work, even as they're trying to write about women, which is a story about Richmond, Virginia, during the while it was the Confederate capital, 1862, 1863. And a lot of historians have written about what were called the bread riots that women led in 1863, the spring of 1863, because food was so short, prices were rising, it's the Confederacy, it's, you know, all the things that are going on in a civil war. And so that's what this particular historian, whose name I won't call right now, but is writing about. But she, I will say she, did start by saying, but in November of that year, 160 prostitutes went to the coroner's office and protested against the death of one of their own.
No way.
Yeah, it's the, you know, and I can't get any more information. I've been looking
you
for
can't
this.
Stop with that, anonymous historian. My God.
I'm still researching. Again, COVID, I've been out of the library. I have to go down to Richmond. I have to look for all these things. But think about it. This is a historian who's writing about women's activism and has spent more time working on the bread riots than just dismissing all of these, you know, dozens and dozens of sex workers who are protesting a violent murder of another prostitute. And going to the coroner's office to do so.
That's incredible.
That's one of my, you know, favorite early stories. It's not the earliest, but I think it's one of my, you know, it's one of the good ones that really shows that we've been doing this for a long time.
Oh, I'm so glad that I asked you that question. I've never heard of that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. It will be in the encyclopedia entry. So there you go.
I'm gonna look it up.
Thank you.
Thank
All right,
you.
so let's turn this over to questions from the audience, and I think we're going to have Erin do that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm sitting here going through my Rolodex of people I remember who've written about the bread riots and going, is it them? Is it them? But good to end on this discussion of essentially union organizing by industry, which is kind of what we're talking about, this industrial perspective. And I think it's been a really wonderful and valuable conversation to think about the ways that this is a labor history, is a history of bodies, is a history of gender and class. There's some really excellent stuff, and we have a lot of good questions. I'm going to claim host privilege and ask mine first. So I found myself thinking about, talk about a line that means something very different out of context, the ubiquitous bumper sticker, well-behaved women rarely make history, which of course in the book itself was meant to be talking about the dearth of sources about the histories of women and gender, and the ways that often many of the people you'd like to research in the past, you only can find them when they've done something that the state has deemed wrong. And then I also found myself, you're talking a lot about this incredible global history of sex work, and thinking about how sort of scholars who study colonialism talk about reading against the archival grain. And I wondered, you talked a bit at the beginning about how hard it is to find sources. I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you worked to read against the grain of sources where the only voice you have is the state criminalizing this person.
It's really difficult. It's really difficult because at a certain point, I suppose you don't want to imagine what was happening, but that's kind of all that you're left with. In the chapter on medieval Britain, there was a woman that was dragged up before the magistrates and charged with keeping a bawdy house, this, that, and the other. And all the records is she's absolutely horrible, she's awful, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Maybe she was, but we've no idea what that woman was going through at that exact moment. We don't know what her situation was. So I suppose all you can do is look at the system that she existed within and try and report on that as accurately as you can. It's really difficult because you can't make stuff up as much as, like, you know, you'd like to fill in the blanks. You can't do that, so you just kind of have to acknowledge that there's a real difficulty with the sources. But then because their voices aren't there, that doesn't mean that you're left with nothing. You can still see a lot of tension and social attitude in the voices of the people that are writing about them, and that's really useful. So it's something that you've just got to be really, really aware of when you are going through this stuff, is who's telling the story and why.
Yeah, and I suppose the same is the case even if it is a sex worker writing their own autobiography. That's still it's still constructed for an audience. And
you get that they were quite big in like the 18th century. They were called harlotographies, like the famous courtesans would write their memoirs, and right up to the 19th century, but they were kind of like soft porn, really. You know, like if someone said, like, Kate, write a memoir of your sex life, you better believe I'm going to exaggerate quite a lot of it. You know, just Kate was unbelievable in bed. She was honestly, she absolutely rocked his world. And it's kind of, it's like, how accurate is that, you know? But again, but also really important if you can kind of meet them where they are and understand what that's doing. But yeah.
Excellent. There's so many good questions. So Jamie asks about, it was a brief conversation about the photos and sex workers looking happy or not looking miserable enough. Can you talk a bit more about why you think that made people uncomfortable and maybe what they expected to see? Also, anyone who says they don't just flip to the pictures in the middle of a book is lying. Like, who would complain about too many pictures?
I agree. The criticism was from sort of that certain radical feminist groups are of the opinion that sex work is always awful and terrible and should be abolished completely, or we should have the Nordic model. And part of that narrative is viewing it as always exploitative and always terrible and always degrading, and anything that kind of disrupts that can be quite problematic. So I genuinely did not think I'm going to put in a load of pictures of happy hookers in this. If you go through it, you can see there's images of women having their head shaved as being Nazi collaborators, and there's women in cages in Japan, and there are pictures of brothels in Nazi concentration camps. So when I read this criticism, like they're too happy, I remember sitting there going, really? But I think that kind of speaks volumes for itself, doesn't it? Is that that stigma demands that the sex worker is penitent or miserable or exploited, and doesn't have much room for the fact that they might smile. That's just, which is always, I found that very, very strange, because that's not the whole truth. It's never the whole truth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that was the criticism.
It's fascinating, and it's sort of just when you bring in labor history, if you think of this as labor,
Yeah,
those sorts of criticisms sort of fall to the side, because it's sort of like no one is always happy in their
no
job.
one's always
No one is always
happy.
miserable.
No,
if you
if you
work
take-
customer service, you can look
Right?
happy and not be happy.
Right?
But thinking of it as a job, in many ways, brings it too close to what people who want to.
Well, it does, and then people get very uncomfortable with that, and they're like, it's not just like a job, and it's kind of like, well, we're all selling something, you know.
Well, many
and
people are selling their bodily labor.
we're selling something, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that the guy in Starbucks would have lovingly made me that cup of coffee if he wasn't being paid to do it. He's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. I mean, all right, he's not having sex with me, so you know there are different things going on there. But I think that if you'd taken your camera in the 19th century to a cotton mill or an industrial factory and had photographed some people, some would have looked happy and some would have looked sad. It's a very complex experience, and trying to force it to be deliriously happy, everyone's having a marvelous time, or horrendous, you're not doing anyone any favors with that.
Yeah, excellent. Sarah mentioned, she says, I'm an autistic occupational therapist and support many autistic sex workers. It's so important for my community to have touch on our terms. What do you see for the future of the intersection of disability and sex work?
Do you know, this is a conversation that I've had a lot, and maybe Mindy, you can speak about this as well. Is I don't know if anyone is researching this, but from personal anecdotal experience, there seems to be a really strong correlation between neurodiversity and people in sex work. There seems, I mean, that's just like a personal experience, but especially with people with any kind of disability, actually, sex work, actually, it can be a really useful way to get money, because you don't have to work 9 to 5, you can work on your own time, be your own boss, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying that it's not without problems, but that is a function that it serves. But certainly I know of many neurodiverse people who are in sex work, and I hope that somebody is researching that and that the prevalence of it. I don't know if anybody is. Mindy, maybe you've heard of some.
I do. There is a woman whose name, I'm sorry, I do not recall right off the minute, but a woman who is doing, I believe it's a dissertation at York University in Toronto, has been doing a lot of work on that and speaking about both her experiences and the experience of others, and the way that sex work is able to give them the kind of flexibility also for that. And then the other thing that I think when we talk about sex work and disability is the idea that sex workers are also sex therapists. And for clients who need therapy, there is a whole series, and there's actually been, I think Margot St. James even sued at one point, had a lawsuit that said that sex work should be decriminalized because at the time that are providing to, because the way she worked, men who need, there's also that Australian documentary, I think it's called Red Road.
Oh yeah, she's brilliant.
Yeah, so there's a documentary that came out of Australia speaking about sort of, I mean, it's an medicalization model of sex work and decriminalization, following in some ways what marijuana has followed recently in the States too, with decriminalization in terms of theory. I don't want to go too far into that, but so yes, I do think that there's a huge overlap, and that's certainly an area that has been explored, is being explored, and I think will be more on the discussion level soon.
And this is sort of a little bit related. William notes, when we think of sex, we tend to think of the physical. Another interesting aspect is the psychological. Does your book focus much on that?
Does it? Do you know? It probably does, but that wasn't like a sort of a thought in my head. If we've got to focus on that, I think that would be an interesting book in and of itself. It's like, what psychological function does it serve? So it wasn't a huge consideration, but it is a subject that absolutely fascinates me. Is like, why do people pay for sex? What is it? Because it isn't just the act itself, because if it was just an orgasm, you can do that for yourself. Most of us quite well. So what is that? Why wouldn't you, we live in a world of Tinder, you can swipe left, swipe right, blah, blah, blah. So why do people pay for it? What happens psychologically? That's something that I think is very fascinating. And I think that a lot of it is about shame. I think a lot of it is people see sex workers because they're horny, and we don't want to sort of dress it up as that it's some kind of mystical thing for everyone, because it's not. Some people just want to come, but for other people it's like maybe they've got a fantasy that they want to explore and they need a safe place to do it, and that they don't feel comfortable asking that for a partner. There are people with very severe disabilities who needs a safe space to be able to explore their sexuality. That is very important. And then there are people that just want to come, and it's a kind of the psychology behind it is fascinating. And I think that at the moment we're rightly focused on the workers' rights. I think that's really important, but I think that we are going to have a conversation soon about destigmatizing why people buy sex in the first place. There is a kind of like and rightly a sort of a movement from sex worker groups themselves that's just like, look, this isn't about clients. If you could just sit this one out, please. But I think that we are going to have to move forward to understand and bring that into the conversation. The why do people do it?
Yeah, and this question is a bit related in a sense, removed another level. Amy says, I read a lot of biographies. My topic of choice is usually dead celebrities of Hollywood's golden era. Your books and your podcasts include a lot of the salacious and scandalous sides of history. What is it, do you think, that piques people's interest and excites people to read and listen to these stories? In the age of this and true crime podcasts, I suppose. Oh,
it's true, isn't it? Like true crime is, I regularly sit there watching documentaries on the most awful stuff. And I sit there afterwards and think, am I a bad person? Or just like, was that there like someone's talking about a chest cavity and I'm like eating a lasagna at the same time? Like, what am I doing in my life? I don't know. I think that there's a certain amount of living vicariously through it. I think that anything that kind of offers us a space of somebody did that, somebody did something really scandalous, somebody did something that we're not going to do. I think that is endlessly fascinating. I think that we become fascinated where we try and see the distance between what we're talking about and ourselves. So like when it's like true crime and violent crime, there is always a certain amount of like, oh, what if that was me? Could I do that? Or what would my family, like you sort of start imagining yourself. And I think that there has actually been a lot of research into why people are so drawn to this. And the jury's out, but there's a few competing theories. Like the one is that it creates a safe space for you to be able to explore sort of darker feelings. I think that certainly with the history of sex, that rings true for me, because it gives people a safe space to be like, yeah, but I'm not here for the sex, I'm learning stuff. It's like, yeah, okay. And that I think gives people a bit of a safe distance. The other one is that it sort of creates empathy. Is that even if you're watching something awful about serial killers or whatever, is you are perhaps empathizing with the victim, or you're trying to see what the distance is between the person who's committed the crimes and yourself. So I think it's all about trying to understand ourselves and how close we could be to that. And of course, we're just endlessly fascinated by sex, aren't we? Maybe I did a podcast the other day about a woman who gave the president of France a blowjob and he had a stroke and died. It's like, that's a hell of a story. That's Marguerite Steinheil. I'm never going to do that. So I want to know about a woman who did. So I think we're drawn to extremes, aren't we?
It's fascinating that you just
the one intervention.
What was that?
Oh, I was going to say there's an intervention there though that you make and others have made too, which is to ensure that the victims' names are named and we know about
Yes.
them as much as we
Yes.
can. Because one of the problems so much with some of the serial killers and everything else is, as you say at the very beginning of your book, we know Jack the Ripper. We don't know the names generally of the 5 women he murdered or what their lives were. And so we allow that to happen. So I think there's also, those interventions are so necessary. And I go with that as well. Just the caution, having just done my own. So,
Oh, I think that you're right. And there does seem to be a process of that at the moment, of like going back over true crime and sort of giving the victims a voice, at least in the UK. I'm not sure if they're doing that in America at the moment, but Hallie Rubenholz The Five was a biography about the victims of Jack the Ripper. It doesn't mention the serial killer at all. And it's like, wow, it's 2002. And kind of everyone's just kind of gone, oh God, who are the victims? So yeah, so I think that that's really important.
No, I was just noticing that you, in describing the way people consume history and stories about sex work, you use the same language that you used about why people purchase sex, that it provides safe spaces for exploring and fantasization. It just happened to be the same. So it's one level extracted from watching these things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's very true. Yeah,
you know, that it's at a double remove, but it's still allowing those same kinds of same kinds of engagement. This is a really interesting question. Gemma asked, with the prevalence of social media and the internet providing so much more context to the voices and stories of sex workers of today, how do you think books like yours would look in 50 years' time? Which sort of gets also to the panic of preservation and archive of digital sources.
I think that social media, we all know that it can do crazy stuff, but I think as far as marginalized groups and groups that don't have a voice very often, I think that it's done amazing things, and certainly for sex workers, because it's allowed organizations to form, alliances to form, groups to form, but by protecting the anonymity. And it's allowed people to do what they've never really had a space to do before, which is speak for themselves. Sex workers have always been here, they have always been here, but people risk a lot by disclosing that they are a sex worker, a lot, and they always have. But social media allows the anonymity, and it has been a real catalyst in the sex worker rights movement. So I think that it's been really, really powerful and really good for changing attitudes as well. Like my mum now follows loads of sex worker accounts online, and she wouldn't have, when would she have done that before, you know, or like engaged with sex worker communities at all. So I think it's been amazing for that. What would the book be like in 10 years? I don't know. I kind of hope that it would look horribly dated in the bit where I'm talking about decriminalization is really important. I hope that people would be reading it going, yeah, but we've got that now. I wish. But yeah.
Yeah. We have a pile more questions. I'm trying to see if I can grab one more, and maybe this one is worth thinking about. Someone has asked here about parallels between the laws regarding sex, drugs, guns, essentially kind of all kinds of vice laws. And I wonder if we can maybe make it the wrap-up question by asking, like, for people who are thinking through this, where this is a thing that they are doing some work in how they think about things, how can taking these laws and thinking about them relative to other areas kind of help us further our understanding of the issue?
I think that there are parallels. You can draw them out, especially with with anything that's criminalized. Drugs is it's not the same, and there are very distinct differences. But there are parallels in that. How long have people been trying to fight the war on drugs and banish drugs? And all that's happened is that criminal gangs have become incredibly wealthy, and you can still get drugs. You can still get drugs. I think that you don't want to compare them too directly. I think there's a big difference between a blowjob and a gun, or a BDSM session and crystal meth. But I think that the idea there is that when you criminalize something that people want, is that it's not successful. You can't legislate something into not being. And I think that what I'd really like to sort of emphasize is that it's incredibly important to talk to and listen to sex workers. Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about the history of sex work. I'll talk about it till the cows come home. And if that research is useful in the current fight for sex workers to get their rights, I'm absolutely thrilled about that. But really what we need to be doing for the first time really in our history is be going, oh, hello, what would you like? That hasn't really happened before, and it can now. And that's incredible, and that's amazing. So so they're the ones that we want to be listening to. But as far as parallels around making things illegal, I think that the history of sex work is evidence in itself. Throughout history, sex workers have been banished, persecuted, excommunicated, mutilated, jailed, forced to submit to horrendous examinations, stigmatized. They're still here. Still here. So it's not worked, has it? So we need to do something different.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for
Thank you.
what I can
Thank
tell from the
you.
chat and the Q&A was just a really invigorating conversation for a lot of folks. So the chat has the address to purchase a copy of the book. We've dropped in the link to Whores of Yore, so you can look at that online. Thank you all for joining us, especially for this, for us, midday event. If you joined late or you want to go back and rewatch or use this conversation in a class, give us a little bit. We'll have it up on the museum's YouTube channel in a little bit. And we'll post that on the website. All of our virtual author programs, and now some of our in-person programs are going to be available. We did our first hybrid program last night. All of these are available through the museum's website for you to rewatch. And check out all of our upcoming author events on our events page. And we'd love to see something else in the future. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, regardless of how much of the day is left where you are.
Thank you so much. Thank you.